We're now going to have the final session for the Haast Symposium, which are is the Q&A session, where we've got 3 of the 4 presenters from this morning, with Dr. Johannes Mattes, Dr. Marianne Klemun, and Dr. Sascha Nolden. The questions have been coming through thick and fast, and I've got a couple for Johannes to begin with. It seemed like many of the overseas scientific societies were most interested in Haast because he was in New Zealand and able to procure specimens, etc. Do you think it is fair to say coming to New Zealand was the making of Haast's career?
Well, I think it was the point for him, for his career. I mean, it was really the start for his career. Of course, he has he got all this education by Hofstadter. So it was really I think for him it was the thing to be here, to have sources, to have the connections, to be a German, so you don't have the problems with the Maori as the British people had. So I think it was really for him it was the key thing to be here. It's often with scientific careers you have to be at the right place at the right time. It's not only talent or expertise. It's always the context. So,
of course, yes. Well, that's excellent. And just one more for you, Johannes. Do you know of any other examples of 19th century scientists having successful careers outside of the network of scientific societies? Do you believe membership was essential for such career success?
Yes, I think so, because the people were connected with these societies. I think also the people like of course, Hofstadter, he had this Novara travel, but of course, you have to get the chance to travel. And these were scientific societies who decided who got. Of course, I mean, the Hofstadter was sent out by the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and the Austrian Academy decided who got the chance to go abroad. And they decided for Hofstadter and for Frauenfeld. So it was, of course, also a networking question for careers.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you very much, Johannes. That's all the questions that have come in for you. We've got a couple from Marianne. Could you suggest why it may have been important for New Zealand to appear on the world stage, and especially make a good impression and have a good reputation? And the question came in because it seemed a particularly important goal for Haast and Hofstadter to do this.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. You have to think about that 7 million people attended this exhibition. So this exhibition is a very, very important place for dissemination of knowledge in combination with sensationalism on the one hand, but on the others you have a lot of materials. So it was really a huge place. So to be as a scientist and to be there with your objects, and these objects have a direct connection to this person. Not every object which was shown had a direct connection to one person, and this was in the case of the birds from New Zealand, because there was a crossing of many meanings. You have on the one hand, you have Hofstadter and Haast, you have these birds, and you have New Zealand, and you have the interest of Austria to get in also places which are not well known. And on the other side, you have you have the time when so the Austria defines the most important places which have more space or not as much space. On the other side, there's an entanglement because in London they also want to have space, but in New Zealand it was decided to get a lot of space, and I think the Hochstädter and his Novara expedition was really the fundament for this connection. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And another question that's come in from you from several different people was about you mentioned about the information labels were an important difference between New Zealand and other countries at the Vienna exhibition. And the question was, why might the other countries have fallen short in this regard? That they were either unlabeled or very poorly labeled or non-uniform.
Mm-hmm. Yes, labeling is on the one hand is well known in every museum. You have this practice. Yes, it's the everyday practice in a museum, but on the other hand, it's a complex practice. Yes, you have to understand it that the knowledge about specimen changes in this time. So if you think about the Moas, there was in the time between 1840 and 1880, the labels changed all the time because so labeling was a very exclusive work on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was a very it was seen as very only naming. What does it mean? So it's really a connection between professionalism and popularization, I think. It's important to think about that. And so not every country had professionalists who went through these materials and checked the labels, I think. But I don't have these labels. That's the problem. I haven't seen them, so I have shown you the exhibition from the Moas in Christchurch to give you to see how these labels, if they are put on an exhibition, then the labels are standardized. Mm-hmm. This is the difference between the museum, where you have different labels sometimes, but in the exhibition you have labels which are standardized and they have the same language. In one room. So according to New Zealand, you had this, I think, this decision from New Zealand to have these labels. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Marianne. So the next question is for Sascha. What sense do you get of Haast as a writer?
I think he was someone who loved to share a story. His style is more narrative. It's quite pictorial, quite descriptive, much more humanist than scientist in some ways, because his published reports were often criticized for going well beyond the scientific facts and just keeping. He was constantly painting landscapes. So he's using word pictures to describe the landscape because he was so passionate about the landscape that he was exploring. He was quite verbose. I think his published lectures tend to be quite long, and therefore the publishing costs would go up. He loved the idea of trying to illustrate his experience, his encounters with nature. So I think as a writer, he was very capable. We know that he was involved early on. One of the things that gave him this opportunity to come to New Zealand was based on his ability to work bilingually in English and German. And that's why he was, someone who was prepared to write in English. His written manuscripts, looking at manuscripts, you can tell how many changes and additions and corrections have been made. So I think he was quite fluent. His fluency of language in both English and French and in German was considerable and reflected his experience. As a writer, I think he was quite accomplished. So that's my view. Certainly in terms of writing the sort of traveler's account, the account of exploration, as well as capturing the scientific facts, the result of his field work.
Thank you, Sascha. There's actually a couple of questions that have come in for some of the speakers that aren't available for this Q&A session that perhaps you and perhaps some of the other speakers might be able to talk to. There was a question that came in for Matthias about the transcription from Hofstadter's diary that suggested that Hofstadter visited Haast aboard the Evening Star on the 11th of January, and yet all the historical accounts suggest that the ship only arrived on the 23rd of that the ship had arrived on the 23rd of December. Do you perhaps know, or can you guess whether or not Haast may have been actually living aboard the Evening Star?
Yeah, the Evening Star was still in port at Auckland Harbour at the time. I mean, anchored off Point Britomart at the time. So Haast may well have been staying on board, but he also had a good relationship with the captain, and they may have gone there to sort of, celebrate before the Evening Star departed again. I think Haast had probably built a positive relationship with the captain and crew on that vessel during his time. So I'm aware of that entry in the diary, and I think they went on board ships to celebrate or to have a drink.
Okay, that's great. And there's one more question that perhaps your knowledge might be able to help Sascha with. The expedition to the Rangitata River in 1861 led to the drowning of Dr. Andrew Sinclair. This question comes in from Malcolm Carr of St. Martin's in Christchurch, and he was curious to know the circumstances about the drowning on the Rangitata River.
That's quite a big question. Yes, we do have quite detailed accounts from that tragedy. Haast wrote a report. We also find that is detailed in the letters to Sir Joseph Hooker. So there is quite a lot of contemporary documentation of the events leading to that tragedy.
Okay. And there's another question that was sent in for Martin that you potentially may know something about, Sascha, which was in 1870, the leading Australian landscape painter Eugene Gerard was awarded the Cross of the Order of Franz Joseph Mackay Vaughan, and Ferdinand von Hofstadter had successfully advocated on behalf of Eugene, as he did later for Julius. And do you have any knowledge of Hofstadter's efforts on behalf of Gerard?
Yes, but not the absolute exact details. I think that question will probably be better answered by Professor Kren in due course. Hofstadter was certainly instrumental in facilitating and promoting Eugen von Gerard's elevation to the Austrian nobility. Gerard's album of landscape paintings was presented as a copy to the emperor, and I think that was really a gesture. I believe that that was another case of very careful diplomacy and certainly concerted efforts, but very effective intervention by Hofstadter in helping friends abroad.
Thank you, Sascha. The last note that I have here from the Q&A session is not a question, but the author Jenny Abrahamson from Christchurch wished to share that her book on John and Charles Innes, the Castle Hill run holders, and they were the run holders at the Castle Hill station, which is west of Christchurch. And they had quite a lot of interactions with Haast. And so there's quite a lot about Haast's life in that book. And Jenny Abrahams wished to bring that to the attention of the symposium. So I'd like to pass now over to you, Sascha, for the closing remarks or any other comments that you'd like to make. Sorry, I've missed here, Marianne.
Yes, I would like to give a comment to the question before.
I apologize.
Yes, no matter. That Haast was very capable of language and describing nature and landscapes. I think it's very common in this group of naturalists who are geologists because they learn to have a look at the language, at this landscape. This is a very, very intensive experience and practice they have to learn because they have to learn to draw and to have to learn to describe. And if you look at the notebooks, I have looked at many notebooks of geologists, then you see there is a difference between the notebook and the describing. But it's the basis for this describing, and the language is very important, the poetry. It's, if you read Franz Unger, Hochstetter's, Eduard Suess, if you read Darwin, you see how they deal with language. So I think it's very common. And the other point is, I want to mention that we separate human history and human abilities and that of naturalists, natural sciences. And there are so many entanglements. Yeah, so we have to think about that in 19th century, these fields are not separated. Yeah? Many of them are. If you read Hochstetter's travel description, then you see he's interested in language. He's interested in not only as a traveler. He's also interested because it's the whole nature and humanity. Yeah. So I think this is part of this professionalism, and not exclude. We shouldn't exclude it from natural history in this time.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. This is absolutely true. These were universal scholars of the 19th century. They were building it. They were following the footsteps of the great naturalist predecessors, and apparently, according to Haast's letter, Hector was so impressed with Hochstetter's geology of New Zealand that he compared him with Humboldt in his younger years. I mean, this is very telling. This was flattery on one level, but it was also true. Humboldt had a great influence on Hochstetter, and others in this period were all looking towards these explorer narratives. That was the model. These incredible descriptions of landscape, of nature, and that representation in narrative forms, which were quite different to perhaps scientific reports in much later periods.
Marianne's comments have actually led to another question coming in, and the question was, have you seen Haast's watercolours? And he made watercolours of his expeditions around New Zealand, and have you compared those to those of other scientists at the time?
Is it a question to me? No.
Have you seen them or not?
Yes, I have seen them, and I think watercolor is a special genre. So it's important to compare sections with each other. But watercolors, they are not made for geologists for the community of geologists. So I think they have another audience to the watercolors. If you compare them, so it's we should compare them with other watercolors. Yeah. I saw some of them and I thought they are really impressive. And I would say there's a lot of art in it, more art than geological viewing on the landscape. Yeah.
That's a really interesting observation about Haast's topographical sketches, because the few examples that we tend to find and are often reproduced or available in digitized forms tend to be those ones that are the final product. So they're like the equivalent of a hand-colored geological section, because what he starts out with are really just the contour lines of the mountains he's observing, and some of those less spectacular, and what I simply mean is more monochrome sketches, are also held in collections, and they're the ones where he's really trying to capture the contour of those mountains he's naming. And then the ones that we know, the ones that have been much more broadly disseminated and published, tends to be the beautiful, almost coffee table book colored watercolors. But I think that is a product that begins in the field. So yes, there's an element of art there, and the watercolor as a medium goes as a way of adding that sort of contour, that texture, again adding that sort of nature to what is the scientific outlines of the ranges he was exploring.
Well, thank you very much, Sascha. That's all the questions that have come in for us. And so perhaps I could pass back to you. Oh, no, I apologise. There's a comment from you.
Mattes, would you like to?
Yes. So I have just a question for Sascha, because your project, what you talked about, I think, there are many other correspondence projects. You talked about the Darwin project. So maybe you can talk a bit more, which I found very, very interesting, is how these different projects can be connected. Because, there is so much out there, and I think it's really worth to compare these different styles also of using correspondence for career reasons or the other stuff. So I think, what do you think about what are your strategies to connect this project to others? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I'm pleased to be able to expand a little bit on that. I think what we've seen these larger projects, the famous projects, and I'm mentioning the Darwin Correspondence because it is one of those that's carried on for several decades and is coming to a close at the end of this year. A major exhibition is being put together to feature correspondence, the letters. This is a wonderful medium, and so much scientific primary research evidence is held in those sources. What we've seen is a sort of a development, almost an evolution from the early efforts made in the Darwin Correspondence project, producing wonderful big volumes, print edition volumes. And now, as we come to the end of that project, we see the development of a dedicated database, the Epsilon database, which is not just it's designed as an aggregator. This allows multiple projects to all contribute in one interface to be searchable. And that's really what I'm excited about. And that's why, even though I'm not a digital humanist, I can see the value of encoding and using standards in order to facilitate that greater aggregation, because the value lies in us being able to access this information as a resource through interfaces that are searchable. In other words, we need to make this material machine readable, and that's what XML, the Text Encoding Initiative, encoding enables. And hopefully increase the capacity for these search engines to facilitate working with the corpus, these corpuses of correspondence as data, the data sets really. And that's what this is an opportunity to contribute to that. It's a global effort, in the community of scholars, archivists, making available. That initial stage is often the digitization, and then of course transcription, which makes them word searchable. And I think that's what's exciting. That this is just what I'm proposing is one small building block in helping to enrich our understanding of those networks, which you so effectively outlined for us today, those networks of communities, and the work of Dr. Klemun in publishing diaries is demonstrate the same sort of thing, where those primary sources of, Director Hauer's diaries are incredibly valuable. It brings together the results of science, but it helps us to understand how that science came about. And it's the people factor, of course, that I'm interested in, particularly because I think it tells us so much about the writers of these letters. There's evidence here that goes well beyond just geology or just one of the other sciences. This is about culture and community, and that's where, yes, it's going to take a considerable effort. As I said, that the challenges are enormous because we've got multiple languages that we're working with for this project, and we're also dealing with almost 700 different handwritings. And I think that's one of the characteristics that makes it so rewarding and so fulfilling, because every time you look at the letters of another correspondent, first of all, you have to work your way into that handwriting. You have to find your way into their language. So that's at the very, very heart of this, I think. But ultimately, I think it serves a very broader universal interest in simply making primary source archival material available. Are there any more comments or questions?
Yes.
Thank you.
If we have time, yes.
We do, yes.
Yes, but there is a difference between the networks in the 18th century and the networks in the 19th century. I think, yes, you have the challenge between three languages, but everybody thinks about the 18th century that you have only Latin, but the Latin communication works. I have done this also for my book about Jacquin, and I didn't I didn't want to edit all the letters. I edited some of them, and this is a very, very hard decision to take out if you have so many. So I think this project for the 19th century, that you have all, you try to, not all, but you try to do that, to edit all the letters. This is very important, because we have also very much for the 18th century, but I think it's a different time about letters and how you deal with letters. Yeah. So we have, on the other side, we have a lot of projects for the 17th and 16th century. It's interesting how it works now with these editing projects and digitalizing the letters and the access, to give them access. Yeah.
No,
yes, gratulations to. Yeah.
The very, very good point you make, the differences in how correspondence networks and in communications developed. And of course, in New Zealand, we're kind of fortunate that written communications, of course, only really began with our European settlement, the Pākehā period of New Zealand history. So we don't have to worry so much about Captain Cook's era. We are a young country here in terms of the history of science, and don't have to contend with those earlier periods in the same way. But you're absolutely right. It is difficult to make a selection, and it's almost more satisfying to attempt, at least, to work with the corpus as a whole.
Yeah, sure.
Sascha, one further question's come in following up on the discussions about Haast's paintings from Malcolm Carr in Christchurch, and he wondered if Haast ever came into contact with the New Zealand 19th century landscape artist Charles Decimus Barroud. Are you aware of any contact between Haast and Barroud?
No, I'm not, to be quite honest. No, I'm well aware of Paul's work held in the Turnbull Library, but I wasn't aware of any connection or any direct link there. But certainly something worth exploring.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like I suspect our European colleagues would like to get to bed, and all the questions have now been answered. So I think I will pass back to you, Sascha, for the closing comments from this very successful symposium.
That's great. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Professor Klemun and Professor Mattes. Wish you a guten Abend, gute Nacht. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the Haast Symposium this weekend. In closing, I would like to just take this opportunity to share with you a little of what lies ahead and to offer my thanks to everyone who has made this event such a success. I'm pleased to be able to let you know that the meeting and presentations have been recorded, and following the usual post-production editing, these recordings will be made available on the website of Canterbury Museum. I'm also pleased to share that most of the papers will be published in a volume of proceedings. Dr. Simon Nathan and George Hook will be joining me as guest editors to manage the peer review process and edit the manuscripts prior to these being passed on to Canterbury Museum for final production. We look forward to being able to present this special bulletin volume of the records of the Canterbury Museum, both as a print and digital edition later this year. I would like to thank Simon Nathan for embracing my original idea of holding a Haast Symposium and being instrumental in enabling what we have achieved this weekend. Thank you, Simon. I would also like to especially thank Julia Bradshaw and Paul Scofield of Canterbury Museum and George Hook of Akaroa as fellow members of the organising committee for their energy and commitment to bringing everything together. It's been a pleasure working with you. A big thank you to Canterbury Museum and the technicians who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes and ensured the smooth running of the event. I'd like to especially acknowledge Vicky Blythe, Jack van Bijnen, Morgan, Marianne, and special thanks to Richard Bell and his team from Shuriken Productions Limited, who have done an incredible job operating the studio setup at the piano in Christchurch. The organising committee join me in once more acknowledging all our contributors and presenters this weekend. This weekend, we have heard presentations of the work of Julia Bradshaw, Senior Curator Human History at Canterbury Museum, Dr. Rosie Crane, Honorary Curator History of Science, Otago Museum, Dr. Ursula B. Görlich, Curator Vertebrate Paleontology at Natural History Museum Vienna, Dr. Matthias Hartzhauser, Head of Geological Paleontological Department, Natural History Museum Vienna, and Dr. Stefanie Jovanovic-Kuspel, Deputy Head of the Department of Archive of Science History at the Natural History Museum Vienna. Then we've heard from Professor Dr. Marianne Klemun, Department of History, University of Vienna, from Professor Dr. Martin Krenn, Head of Archive for the History of Science, Natural History Museum Vienna, and Dr. Johannes Mattes, Research Project Leader, Austrian Academy of Sciences, Vienna. Yesterday, we heard from Dr. Simon Nathan, Emeritus Scientist, GNS Science, Geologist and Science Historian, Wellington, myself, as Research Librarian of the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington, the work of Dr. Vanessa our De Pietri Research Fellow, School of Earth and Environment, Te Kura Aronukurangi, University of Canterbury, and of course, Professor Dr. Paul Scofield. A big thank you to everyone. And finally, a huge thank you to Dr. Ursula Rack, Austrian Honorary Consul in Christchurch, for your introductory words of welcome this morning, helping us reconfirm the long-standing connections between Vienna and New Zealand, first established during the visit of the Navarre expedition in 1858. And last and most importantly, I would like to personally thank Anthony Wright, Director of Canterbury Museum, for making this possible. Thank you so much.